Hello my dear students. In this video we're going to be discussing line graphs in more details. Get your pens and papers ready and let's go.
We structure them the same way we structure all Task 1 reports, and the same steps followed in bar graph descriptions are also followed here. First, I study the infographic by looking at what is presented on the X and Y axes. This is a line graph on the amount of CO2 released by individuals in 4 different countries. On the X-axis, I have the 40 years highlighted, extending from 1967 to 2007. And on the y-axis, the amount is given in metric tons. I also have to pay attention to the peaks, highest points, or tops, and to the valleys, lowest points, or bottoms. For example, the CO2 release of each Swedish citizen was at its peak in 1977, and that of a British individual was at its lowest in 2007. Yet, Britain's CO2 emissions remain the greatest over the period highlighted. Looking at stability aspects is also key. Italian and Portuguese individuals or inhabitants' discharge of CO2 flattened out in the last 10 years. We should also clarify the upward and downward trends. Here, both Italy and Portugal had upward trends, while United Kingdom had a falling one, similar to that of Sweden after 1977. Similar and clearly different patterns should also be grouped with one another. Here, Portugal and Italy, CO2 emissions are both rising steadily, which is a similarity. And we can observe that from 1977 to 1987, UK CO2 emissions fell gradually or steadily, meaning slowly, while that of Sweden fell steeply or rapidly. Anomalies or exceptions are another key feature to be illustrated. For instance, the steep rise in Sweden's CO2 emissions in the first 10 years is an anomaly to the speeding drop that followed for the next 30 years. So now, let's do the task. To write the introduction, all you need is rephrase the question header. The question header here, the graph below shows average carbon dioxide emissions per person in the United Kingdom, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal between 1967 and 2007. I wrote, the line graph is a very clear demonstration of standard CO2 discharge. So that is a synonym to emission per capita, per person in Britain, Sweden, Italy, and Portugal over the period of 40 years. From 1967 to 2007, that is a period of 40 years. Let's learn the following phrases. Clear demonstration rather than shows. Per capita, per person, over the period of 40 years. For the overview and the body paragraphs, select and report the main features. Only the main features, not all features. And most importantly, make comparisons. I noticed that Britain had a downward trend, yet remained the highest, and that Portugal had an upward trend, yet remained the lowest. So I wrote, it can be observed that although British individuals' emissions of CO2 had a downward trend, they still exhaled the highest amount of carbon dioxide relatively. On the contrary, despite the steady growth in Portuguese dwellers' release of CO2, it remained the lowest over most of the period highlighted. Some useful language, it can be observed that exhaled, release. On the contrary, transition signal, steady growth, dwellers, people who live in a place. The period highlighted. For my body paragraphs, I'm going to group up or lump up similar patterns together. These are Italy and Portugal, which both rose. I chose to present Italy's CO2 emission in 1967, which was about 4 metric tons, and rose to almost 6 in 1977 and peaked at roughly 8 metric tons in 2007. I will also mention that Portugal experienced a similar pattern with a 2.5 metric tons gap or difference. I wrote, along the 40 years in question, both Italy and Portugal evidently manifested steady increases in the amount of CO2 each of their citizens emitted. The former's typical CO2 release was approximately 4 metric tons in 1967, noticeably escalated to almost 6 metric tons 10 years later, and peaked at roughly 8 metric tons at the end of the period in question. Interestingly, Portugal experienced a similar pattern with a gap of nearly 2.5 metric tons along the span of the 40 years. Some useful language would be along the 40 years in question, evidently manifested, showed clearly, steady increases, rising slowly, gradually. The former, this is a reference word. The former and the latter are two referencing words that are highly recommended. Former refers to Italy. The latter, which I did not choose to use, refers to Portugal. Approximately, noticeably escalated, peaked at roughly. Interestingly, experienced a similar pattern along the span of the 40 years. In my second body paragraph, I will lump up the downward trends of UK and Sweden together. I will also mention the amount of CO2 emissions they both fell to in 2007. I will shed light upon the significant rise of CO2 emissions by Swedish individuals in the first 10 years, which was followed by a dramatic dive. And this would be the last paragraph. In contrast to the previous patterns, both England and Sweden had deteriorations plummeting at around 9 and 5.5 metric tons respectively. Despite the significant climb in CO2 released by Swedish inhabitants in the first 10 years, culminating at nearly 10 metric tons in 1977, a dramatic dive followed, where discharge reached about 7 metric tons 10 years later. Some useful language: deteriorations, falls, plummeting, reaching a valley, respectively. Referencing word, it refers the 9 to England and the 5.5 to Sweden. Inhabitants, another word for citizens or dwellers, culminating at reaching a peak, dramatic dive, great fall. And this is my report. It has an introduction, overview, first body paragraph, and this is the second. The second is made of only 2 sentences, but the second sentence is very complex that it's more than enough. I wrote 214 words. There is absolutely no problem if you cross the word limit as long as you're not making grammatical mistakes or vocabulary mistakes or structure mistakes. And that's everything. Thank you for watching.